Hello and welcome to episode 69 of On Liberty. Live from, well, I was going to say live from the Centre for Independent Studies, but it is in a way live from the Centre for Independent Studies. It's actually my backdrop here at home in Sydney. I'm your host, Tom Switzer, standing in for my colleague, Salvatore Babones. It's always great to have your company. Now, today on the show, Neville Bonner, our nation's first Aboriginal Australian parliamentarian. He was a Liberal senator in the 1970s and early to mid 1980s. He died in 1999. Bonner came to the Senate 50 years ago last month, and he gave his maiden address to Parliament 50 years ago this month. Sean Jacobs is the author of a new biography on Neville Bonner, and it's published by our friends at Connor Court. G'day, Sean.
G'day, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And I should stress from the outset, Sean, that you wrote an essay on Neville Bonner in the CIS, now defunct, in-house magazine called Policy, correct? That was about 2013.
That's right, Tom. Yeah, so it's probably my first published piece on Bonner, and not long after I actually discovered his story. And you know, in that, I really teased out some of the, I guess, self-help traits or those resilience elements of Bonner's story, and applied them to sort of contemporary lessons, and then just picked some of those up, and I've applied some of those in the new biography I've put together, but wrapped around a bit of the history at the time. But yes, Tom, it was written in the wake of discovering or first coming across Bonner's story, and it is an amazing story, and I think an undertold one as well.
Indeed. Well, as I said, it's been 50 years ago since he came to Parliament, our first Aboriginal parliamentarian. Take us back to 1971, Sean.
Yeah, sure, Tom. So this was an interesting time in Australian politics. This was 4 years, of course, after the 1967 landmark referendum on Indigenous Australians. You know, understandably, there was a bit of an atmosphere of radicalism or activism that existed at the time, especially around the Indigenous rights movement. But Bonner was on a bit of a different trajectory. So he had recently joined or recently headed up the One People of Australia League, which was a Brisbane-based assimilationist and integrationist organisation. It was really founded on the principle of building a cohesive society and assimilation and integration, again, for Indigenous Australians into mainstream Australia. He formally joined the Liberal Party in the late 60s, and I'm sure we'll get around to that. But really, Bonner had spent most of his life until then as a very much a blue-collar man. He famously said that he worked every job known to man throughout northern New South Wales and central and outback Queensland. And, you know, he certainly followed an interesting route to Parliament. So actually, up until the 60s, or late 1960s, he was actually a bridge carpenter working for the Moreton Shire Council. So a very interesting story, but interesting times as well.
And a decent life before he became a senator in 1971. He was born in 1922 under a tree.
That's right, Tom. So born into very humble circumstances. As you know, born under a tree on Eucheriba Island, which is in northern New South Wales, right on the mouth of the Tweed River. And Bonner actually said that it was a miracle that he'd survived those days when, you know, you look back or when you think about some of the things that were taking place around there at the time. So he moved to Lismore at a young age with his brother Henry. He never met his English father. Bonner was mixed race. But, you know, looking back on this time, and it was very difficult circumstances, there was kind of a sort of humorous kind of reflection with the arrow of time. Bonner spent most of his life thinking he was born in 1917 and not 1922. He only discovered this actually in 1970 after having to fill out his Senate paperwork and returning to Lismore to find his birth records. I think it actually put him back under the age of 50. So it's kind of the problem that you want to have, especially probably around that age, is getting 5 years back.
He was 5 years younger than he thought he was.
That's right. So, gosh, yeah, pretty good to good to know. But yes, as you know, Tom, pretty humbling conditions, and being born under a tree to then becoming an Australian senator or federal senator for Queensland. What an incredible story.
Yeah, you say he lost his mother at an early age, and as you say, he never met his English dad, so he was pretty much reared by his grandmother. Tell us more about that.
That's right. So, Tom, Bonner's mother, Julia, passed away in around 1933. So his grandmother, Granny Ida, ended up raising him. Bonner said that actually everything that he was going to achieve, or everything that he achieved, was really down to his grandmother, Granny Ida's guidance. Whenever you hear Bonner speak, of course, and a lot of people comment on this, that you really hear his eloquence in his words, and that really was down to his grandmother's correction and pronunciation, and that discipline as well, about being able to speak well and speak and have a good command of English. And I think that's really testament to her discipline and her guidance at those formative early years in the 30s, and especially when considering that Bonner had very limited formal schooling. He only had about 10 months at Beaudesert State School in Queensland to draw from.
Contrary to what you'll hear from advocates of identity politics and those who subscribe to cancel culture, racism self-evidently was a far bigger problem in the world in the 1920s and 30s than it is today. That is self-evident. So Bonner, obviously growing up, would have copped racism. Tell us about his experience with racism, Sean.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Tom, and I think you really see that in Bonner's story. Actually, at the start of the book, I actually write of a really quite harrowing instance of Bonner's first taste of school. So he was in Lismore. Him and his brother Henry had been offered an opportunity to attend South Lismore School, and Bonner's mother, Julia, not having anywhere near enough money for school uniforms, had to basically fashion them from inside out, calico bags, sacks, essentially. And so the boys presented to school at about 8 or 8:30 in the morning. And then by about 9:30, so after about an hour, half the school had cleared out. Word had gone viral, at least by 1930 standards, that there were 2 black boys in the school, and parents had quickly come to spirit their kids away. And it's a very heartbreaking story. But, there were plenty more examples like that existed throughout Bonner's life. And as you know, Tom, these were real instances of discrimination, racism, and of course, segregation as well. But I think it sort of speaks to that, again, that level of resilience to keep sort of persisting, regardless of the circumstances that he found himself in, and a testament to a great story as well, Tom.
Indeed, indeed. Now, back to the late 60s, early 70s, when he fills this Senate vacancy, you mentioned before he was becoming more politically aware. Now, he supported the anti-communist cause, Christian causes. He was a Catholic. Tell us about those philosophical influences on his life in the mid to late 60s, Sean.
Yeah, no, that's right. So he had a conservative disposition, or a conservative philosophy. I think a lot of that had actually been shaped over time. So he was a fierce individual. So he'd lived, a very frontier sort of lifestyle, and he was, he actually arrived at becoming a liberal through, an amusing instance in 1967, and we can touch on that in a second. But I do think that if you look at Bonner's life, it really lines up well with liberal principles, in the sense that, being an individual, being pragmatic about certain questions, the religious identity perspective, I think, had really become apparent, because religion was essentially Bonner's pathway to assimilation and integration and building skills. And I think as well, when you look at, for example, civic discourse and respect for individuals and respect for different points of view, Bonner had really spent a lifetime, actually up until the late 60s, really learning or understanding different points of view, being on a different perspective, or actually having a different perspective on different social issues and those sorts of things, whether it was capital punishment, whether it was the Springbok tour in the early 70s, and actually learning to understand different points of view and respect those as well. So he was a conservative. It was influenced a lot by his religious faith to a degree, but also his life as well, Tom.
Yeah. And he fills a Senate vacancy in 1971, August of 71, Bill McMahon's Prime Minister. How did he get that, the Senate vacancy in 1971? Because remember, he's the first Aboriginal Australian to be in Parliament. How did Neville Bonner, of all people, fill a Senate vacancy?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting, Tom. So he had actually put his hand up on the Senate ticket for the 1970 federal Senate election, and he was third on the ticket, so he knew that it was quite an unwinnable position. But Bonner was pretty blasé about putting his hand up. It seems that he actually made that decision at a cocktail party down the Gold Coast one night when he was balancing a beer in one hand and prawns in the other, he said. But what had actually happened was that people kept coming around asking him when it would be his turn to run. So he just decided to say, hey, look, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. So he was, pretty blasé about that 1970 run. But he did get a lot of name recognition or name profile at the time. So being third on the ticket, he wasn't successful. So the two ahead of him went through. But then about 6 months later, in early 71, as you know, Tom, his fortunes turned a little bit. So Senator Dame Annabel Rankin was appointed as a High Commissioner to New Zealand. And then that created a casual Senate vacancy. So Bonner ended up filling that. And I think, I write in the book that for the first time in his life, he actually felt entitled. I don't think he was too far off here, because you go back only a matter of months and he was naturally the next choice in line with the two other Senate candidates ascending the year before. He was naturally the right choice. So it was a historic moment in 71 when he filled that casual vacancy, but his path leading up to it was quite an interesting one and very opportune, but one that I think that we look back on kind of fondly.
Yes. And you make it very clear that he was proudly, unapologetically a Liberal. Tell us about that story in 1967 when he's handing out how to vote cards on the Indigenous referendum, and his experience with one Bill Hayden.
That's right. So this is an interesting story, and I did just flag it before, but whenever Bonner was actually asked why he became a Liberal, he recounts this story that took place in 67. So, Tom, it was an Oxley polling booth, which is in the west of Brisbane, and as you know, Bonner was handing out how to vote cards for Liberal mates, so he wasn't a card-carrying member at all at the time of the Liberal Party. And Bill Hayden, who was then the member for Oxley and Labor, the Labor member for Oxley, rather.
Future Labor leader as well. Future Labor leader.
That's right. Yes, that's right. So, correct. And so Bill Hayden hops out the car and sees Bonner standing there handing out how to vote cards for the Liberals, and he goes up to Bonner and goes, "Oh, what the heck are you doing handing out for this lot? We do more for you lot than the bloody other lot do." So Bonner was really actually taken back by that, because he felt that how you look shouldn't determine how you vote. And that evening, Bonner actually approached his mates and said, "Give me the paperwork," and then he became that evening a card-carrying member of the Liberal Party. But yeah, look, there is a bit more philosophy guiding Bonner than that. And then that story actually lets on, and I do unpack a little bit of that in the book. But it's an amusing instance of how he actually became a member of the party.
But it's also a reminder that many people on the left ideological spectrum crudely think that people of colour, of different ethnic backgrounds, will be more attracted to leftist centre causes, and it's such a crude way of viewing people's political views. And you get this a lot in the United States. If you're African American and you're a conservative, you're seen as some sort of oxymoron. Same thing in Britain. And of course, Neville Bonner experienced it in 67.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Tom, and I do touch on some of those international examples in the book as well. It certainly confronts assumptions. You know, if you do find yourself of a certain complexion and you're on the centre right side of politics, it makes it very kind of slippery around how the media, commentators, or even individuals or an opposing political party actually handles you or handles the things that you kind of care about or speak up for. And, this is really just one of the examples about why I find, Bonner's story just fascinating.
And also, you make it very clear that Neville Bonner revered Sir Robert Menzies.
That's right, Tom. So, if you just sort of go down the list really about Robert Menzies' liberal statement of beliefs and Bonner's beliefs, they really just overlap almost near perfectly, in terms of respect for Parliament and the rule of law. Like Menzies, Bonner was a fierce advocate for our established institutions. He called Parliament the nation's council of elders, and he encouraged that he wanted more Indigenous Australians in the chamber and not less. When you look at freedom of speech and religion, Bonner said that when coming to Canberra, his priorities were God in this rank order: nation, state, and then party. And as I touched on before, religion really was his path to assimilation and integration, and building skills and being able to be a full participant in mainstream Australian society. But you just go down the list, Tom, and it's really quite uncanny, really, how Bonner's life matched up with a lot of those liberal principles in terms of, choosing your own way in life, protection from exploitation, and then also that individual initiative and that enterprise too. He believed, like Menzies, that sound fiscal management and a humming economy kind of was a tide that lifted all boats and provided opportunities for people if they were willing to take them, regardless of complexion. So he revered Menzies.
A Menzian liberal, yeah. And it just occurred to me, and I know you know the answer to this, but there is one member of Parliament today, either the House of Representatives or the Senate, who's actually met Sir Robert Menzies. Now, of course, Menzies was Prime Minister twice, from 39 to 41, and then 49 to 66. My colleague at CIS, Scott Prasser, has written a very good book on Sir Robert Menzies. Menzies died in 1978, but there is one member of Parliament, the House and Senate, who's actually met Robert Menzies. This is a detour away from Neville Bonner, but who's that member of Parliament, Sean?
Look, it's Ken Wyatt, Tom. Ken Wyatt.
Who's also Aboriginal.
That's right. So first Indigenous member of the House of Reps. So very fitting, actually.
It is fitting, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's an amazing story. Now, listen, I thought this was quite interesting. Oh, by the way, just tell us a bit about yourself. Now, you're born in Papua New Guinea in the mid-1980s and you live in Queensland. Tell us more about your own upbringing.
Yeah, sure, Tom. So, there is a bit of a sort of mini biography within the pages of the book. So I am also mixed race. I was born in Papua New Guinea, although I'm not Indigenous Australian. But I really, again, was kind of drawn to Bonner's story because it's one that is about walking in two worlds and balancing different identities, which I think is something that a lot of us have to varying degrees. So I studied at Griffith University in Brisbane. I spent my sort of first years working for the Australian Aid Program in the South Pacific. And I've returned over the years to work in PNG in a range of kind of capacities, then also in Canberra, and I live in Queensland now and have worked with local, state, and again, federal government. So, Tom, I've sort of been around government and I guess politics, to know enough, I suppose, around generally the sketch or the broad outline of Bonner's story, but, not to a degree that I was, at least until a few years ago, about what kind of person he was and his upbringing and his trajectory as well. So this is my second book, and yeah, as you know,
the first book was on identity politics, also published by Connor Court, correct?
Correct, Tom. So that it's called Winners Don't Cheat. So it came out a couple of years ago in 2018, and that really, I think, I do have a chapter on race, race and identity politics, and I actually touch on Bonner's story in that in only a number of pages, but really pulling out those same elements that I had in that policy magazine piece that you mentioned at the start around resilience, building skills, about being an individual and prospering in a modern world, but finding the right place for culture and balancing those things too. So the chapter from memory is circumstances and race are no excuse, and that was certainly Bonner's philosophy and message.
Individuality, liberalism, meritocracy, all good, but you also write about Neville Bonner understanding the tension, even chasm, between protest and compromise. I thought this was a key part of your book, Sean. You say that Bonner recognised it was better to work within the system and not in spite of it. This is a Bonner quote. If you want to beat the system, you do it in a sensible, quiet way.
Yeah, that's right. A wonderful philosophy. And I think that's such a respectful way to look at existing institutions. And again, balancing that with the tension of change and culture as well. There's a really interesting instance or a great story that I mentioned in the book from 1973, where Bonner's outside Parliament House and he sees a group of pro-Indigenous protesters almost sort of running towards Parliament House to protest, and he gets in between Parliament House and the protesters, and he stops them and he points to it and he goes, look, that's our nation's council of elders up there. You wouldn't walk into an Indigenous council of elders and start demanding things left, right and centre. So why would you think that you could walk into that one and start demanding things? And it's a really lovely, I think, instance of a few instances, I think, where he was trying to balance that tension or that respect for our existing institutions. And again, I think there's that wonderful element of our national parliament being the nation's council of elders and respect for that and respect for institutions.
And for his sin, Sean, he was called a Black Judas, among other disgraceful insults.
That's right. So, this, being a member of the Liberal Party, being a Conservative, being in the public spotlight as well, and some of the things that he espoused really earned him an army of enemies at the time. It put him on the sort of opposite side to a lot of the Indigenous rights groups at the time, which were very much focused on politics. But Bonner's time at the One People of Australia League was actually focused on Indigenous welfare, and not of the sort of welfare that we sort of think about today, but that sort of element of arming Indigenous Australians with skills, education and different norms and attitudes and priorities and behaviours to be able to integrate, but also be successful and compete in a modern Australia. But yes, Tom.
Yeah, self-evidently, Neville Bonner should be a household name in this country. Regrettably, he's not. Now, it has to be said, only one program on the ABC, the public broadcaster, has aired a program dedicated to pay tribute to Neville Bonner to mark the 50th anniversary of his stint in Parliament. But if Charles Perkins were the first Aboriginal Australian to serve in Parliament, or a more left-wing activist Aboriginal Australian was the first Indigenous parliamentarian, I bet you bottom dollar, Sean, we know all about it on the ABC. Seriously.
No, that's right, Tom. And I do touch on this a little bit in the book, that there is a suspicion, I think, and I think it's fairly founded, that Bonner's legacy isn't kind of what it is because of his conservative philosophy, or that he found himself on the centre-right side of politics, which is very unfair when you think about it. And it's certainly one of the things that surprised me about his story was simply that he'd been camouflaged for so long, and I do think that it is down to his philosophy and where he found himself on the political spectrum. Had he been a member of the Labor Party, I suspect, or on the progressive side of politics, as you've touched on, I think there would be a lot more celebration or fanfare around his story.
Indeed. So he was a senator from 71 right through to 83. Now, of course, Bob Hawke defeats Malcolm Fraser in the 83 election. Now, Anthony Carr, who's a regular listener to On Liberty, great to hear from you, Anthony. He asks, why did the Liberals fail to put Neville Bonner in a winning position in 1983? He was relegated to third on the Queensland Senate ticket, so he lost his Senate position at the 1983. Now, I understand, I think you mentioned this, that both Malcolm Fraser, who was the Prime Minister at the time, the Treasurer at the time, John Howard said this was a low moment for the Liberal Party. Why on earth didn't the Queensland Liberal Party make sure that he was re-elected in the Queensland Senate ticket?
Yeah, fair enough. It's a great question there from Andrew. I think, there are a couple of competing views. There are different perspectives. You can still speak to people that were around at the party at the time. There's a camp or a perspective that mentions that, Bonner wasn't doing enough to court pre-selectors across the state, as, all politicians should do.
There's that. Story either, is it?
No, that's right, exactly. And, the other sort of element too is that he was tactically unappealing. And this is probably one of the elements that I think gets a lot of, that I cover a fair bit in the book, or at least to some degree. Liberal Party headquarters at the time felt that he wasn't tactically appealing to be able to put up in 1983. So therefore putting him to third behind Kate Sullivan and McGibbon would actually be the right spot for him in terms of tactical outcomes and electoral calculation. It was kind of, there's different competing views, and quite interestingly, actually, right after the pre-selection took place and Bonner was placed for third on the ticket, there was a resolution actually put forward that actually switched the order. So Kate Sullivan actually offered her place on the ticket to Bonner, putting him at second, which would actually put him into a winnable position, and that was knocked back. So Bonner said that what ended what dropped him on the ticket to third was the powers that be, quote unquote, at headquarters.
Big mistake. He was popular with the community across Australia. He was the Australian of the Year in 1979, which of course you document. And the Labor government, Prime Minister Bob Hawke, appointed Neville Bonner to a full-time role on, of all places, the ABC board. Tell us the story about Neville Bonner as a board member of the ABC with the then ABC managing director, David Hill, and their trips around the country.
Fair enough. No, this is an interesting one. And actually, yeah, so as you know, Tom, Hawke had actually called Bonner the night before the election, and, he recorded that he was very sorry that Bonner had to run as an independent. But he actually said to Bonner, look, if things don't work out, we'll work something out for you. And so that's what Hawke actually did. So as you know, he appointed Bonner to the ABC board. Bonner, of course, was the only, just coming out of politics, the only full-time board member. So he's often sent to the more rural or remote parts of Australia. And on one trip with the managing director at the time, David Hill, Hill would come back to the offices and apparently said, I'm not going out with that so-and-so again. Everywhere you go, everyone but he stops him in the street and comes up to him, and it takes ages to actually get anywhere. And but Bonner actually quickly qualified, with his sort of characteristic modesty that wasn't, Hill wasn't saying that out of being cynical, but that was just kind of what Australia was, and the good-natured support that Bonner had actually been able to carry throughout the time. And he actually noted too that Bonner spent a lot of his time after leaving the Senate in 83 convincing people that he wasn't actually a senator anymore. He was wildly popular, and people, of all persuasions came up to him and kept calling him Senator Bonner.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we lost Neville Bonner in 1999. One of his last public acts was at the 1998 Constitutional Convention at the Old Parliament House, when he strongly defended the monarchy and opposed all the various Republican motions. That's interesting. That gets a mention in your book. But I thought we'd conclude, Sean, because we're running out of time, and this has been a terrific discussion. Thanks so much for tuning in today. But I'd like to conclude with something you say towards the end of your book, and it's a theme that we've already addressed, and that is identity politics. You make the point that these days we are becoming accustomed to outbreaks of acute racial sensitivity, trigger warnings, microaggressions, safe spaces, all these things. Final question, what do you think Neville Bonner today, 50 years ago since he came to the Senate, what would Neville Bonner make of identity politics?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Tom. I think that he would be entirely suspicious of it. I think he'd think that it'd be rather terrible, given that all of the progress that had been made with reconciliation, not just at an institutional level, but among individuals. The sheer number of Indigenous Australians doing well and living within mainstream Australia and again prospering. He would find it very suspicious that identity politics had emerged. Even just in the time that that Policy magazine article that I wrote in 2013 and today, I sort of rarely talk about identity politics because it kind of wasn't exactly on the radar. And you can just see in the last sort of 7-8 years, it's really popped up. And I think, again, Bonner would have been entirely suspicious about it. He had gave a really good quote upon receiving a honorary doctorate from Griffith University in 1993, where he said that, a society works best when played like a piano, when the black and white keys are played together. And I thought that was just a wonderful,
Beautiful.
kind of touching tribute to how Bonner's philosophy worked. His integrationist and assimilationist philosophy, but a great antidote to modern identity politics, but a really great antidote or a great, endorsement for mainstream Australia and living a good and decent life, which is what Bonner was very much about.
A very important message indeed, Sean. Thank you so much. Now, you're the biographer of this book on Neville Bonner. For those of you who are interested in the book, I encourage you to buy a copy. Just go to the Connor Court website, connorcourtpublishing.com.au. Sean, great to be with you again. And let's hope we can do this in a real event once we get over these lockdowns.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. And yeah, absolutely look forward to it. And that crowd behind you hopefully will be moving next time we see it.
Good on you, Sean. And thanks to all of you for tuning into On Liberty. Salvatore Babones will be back next week talking with Peter Jennings, the leading Australian strategic thinker. Thanks so much.